You know those muscle cars that feel like legends because no one ever sees them? The 1980s had some rare beasts that have become nearly impossible to find today. From forgotten factory experiments to limited production legends, these are the 10 rarest 1980s muscle cars you will never see on the road. 10th Hurst Olds Cutlass. The Hurst Olds Cutlass is one of those muscle cars that almost no one sees on the road today. Oldsmobile brought back the legendary Hurst Olds name in the early 80s, but this wasn't just another special edition. It was a rare, factory-built muscle car with serious performance and one of the wildest shifters ever put in a car. First, let's talk numbers. Oldsmobile only made 3,001 of these in 1983, making it one of the rarest muscle cars of the decade. Unlike many 80s cars that were stuck with weak engines due to emissions regulations, this Cutlass had some real muscle under the hood. It came with a 5.0-liter V8, producing 180 horsepower and 245 pound-feet of torque. That might not sound crazy today, but in the early 80s, it was enough to make this car a street king. What really made the 1983 Hurst Olds special was its lightning rod shifter. Instead of a regular automatic shifter, it had 3 separate levers that let drivers manually shift through the gears like a race car. It looked intimidating, but once you got the hang of it, it gave the car a unique feel that no other muscle car had. The two-tone black and silver paint job with red striping made sure this car stood out, and it came with a bulging hood scoop that made it look even more aggressive. Oldsmobile also upgraded the suspension and put in a limited-slip rear differential, making it more fun to drive than a regular Cutlass. Despite its cool looks and unique features, most of these cars either got stored away or were driven hard and eventually disappeared. Finding one today in good condition is almost impossible. That's why the 1983 Hurst Olds Cutlass 15th Anniversary Edition is one of the rarest muscle cars of the 1980s. You will probably never see one in person, but if you do, you will know you are looking at something special. Devati Ford Mustang SVO. The Ford Mustang SVO is yet another muscle car that many people have never seen in real life. It was Ford's attempt to bring high-tech performance to the Mustang lineup, and while it was ahead of its time, it ended up becoming one of the rarest Mustangs ever made. At a time when muscle cars were still recovering from the horsepower slump of the 1970s, Ford did something different. Instead of a big V8, the Mustang SVO had a 2.3-liter turbocharged inline-4 that made 175 to 205 horsepower, which was impressive for the mid-80s. This was the same era, when a standard Mustang GT only had around 200 horsepower from its V8. So the SVO wasn't just some economy car pretending to be fast. It was the real deal. But power wasn't the only thing that made the Mustang SVO special. It had a unique front-end design with flush headlights, a functional hood scoop, a large dual-plane rear wing, and lightweight 16-inch aluminum wheels, something rare for muscle cars at the time. Ford also gave it upgraded Coney adjustable shocks, 4-wheel disc brakes, and a limited slip differential, making it one of the best handling Mustangs of its era. Despite being a cool, futuristic take on the Mustang, it made much sales. Muscle car fans still wanted a V8, and the SVO's high price tag didn't help. In total, only 9,844 units were produced over 3 years, making it incredibly rare today. Most of these cars either got modified, wrecked, or simply disappeared over time. Today, the Mustang SVO is one of the rarest muscle cars of the 1980s, and chances are you will never see one outside of a car show. Osme Chevrolet Camaro IROC-Z Jeddah LE. The regular IROC-Z was already a legend in the 80s, but the one LE package was an ultra-rare, race-ready version that Chevrolet built in secret for serious performance junkies. If you have never seen one in person, you are not alone. Only a handful were made, and most were pushed to their limits on the track. So, what made the one LE different? It wasn't just a sticker package or some fancy badging. This was a real performance upgrade designed for racing. The one LE package included bigger brakes, aluminum drive shafts, upgraded fuel systems, and a race-tuned suspension that made it dominant on road courses. Chevrolet never officially advertised it, and it wasn't even listed as an option you could check off at the dealership. Instead, the 1LE package was triggered automatically when buyers ordered an IROC-Z with the G92 performance axle and no air conditioning. Under the hood, the 1LE came with a high-output 5.7-liter V8, making around 245 horsepower, which was impressive for the late 80s. But what really made this car special was how well it handled. Unlike most muscle cars of the time, which focused on straight-line speed, the 1LE could carve through corners like a real sports car. Now, here's why you will probably never see one. Less than 500 units were built between 1988 and 1990. Since it was designed for racing, most of these cars were bought by teams who used them hard, leaving only a handful in good condition today. Many people didn't even know the 1LE existed until years later, making it one of the most mysterious and sought-after Camaros ever. Today, it is one of the rarest muscle cars of the 1980s, a forgotten track weapon that proves Chevrolet was serious about performance even when nobody was paying attention. 7th, Pontiac Firebird Trans Am Recaro Edition. The Pontiac Firebird. Trans Am Recaro Edition was a special edition of the Firebird Trans Am. While the third-generation Trans Am was already a head-turner in the 80s, the Recaro Edition took things to another level with a rare mix of style, luxury, and performance. Pontiac didn't make many of these, which is why spotting one today is almost impossible. So, what made the Recaro Edition special? First off, the name comes from the Recaro racing seats, which were some of the best performance seats of the era. They weren't just comfortable, they held you in place like a true race car seat, making this Trans Am feel way sportier than the standard version. This special edition also had a unique black and gold two-tone paint scheme, giving it a sleek, aggressive look. It was like Pontiac's way of making a modern version of the legendary Smokey and the Bandit Trans Am. Gold accents covered the wheels, decals, and even the interior trim, making it one of the best-looking Firebirds ever built. Under the hood, the 1982 to 1983 Recaro Edition came with a 5.0-liter V8, producing 165 to 190 horsepower, depending on the configuration. That might not sound crazy today, but back then, it was enough to give the car some serious street presence. Meanwhile, you will probably never see one because Pontiac only made about 2,500 units of this special edition. That's a tiny number compared to regular Trans Am production. Over time, many of these cars were either modified, wrecked, or simply disappeared into collections, making them extremely rare today. If you ever spot a Trans Am Recaro Edition on the road, you're looking at a forgotten piece of 1980s muscle car history. It was bold, unique, and built in such small numbers that most people don't even know it existed. Altonja Buick GNX. The Buick GNX is one of those muscle cars that seems almost mythical, shocking the world by outrunning Corvettes and Ferraris while looking like a regular Grand National. But the GNX wasn't just fast, it was rare, and that's why you will probably never see one on the road today. Buick built the GNX in 1987 only as a send-off for the already legendary Grand National. But this wasn't just another turbocharged Regal. It was a heavily upgraded, track-dominating beast. It possessed a 3.8-liter turbocharged V6, but with some serious tweaks from McLaren and ASC. Officially, it made 276 horsepower and 360 pound-feet of torque, but real-world tests suggested it was closer to 300-plus horsepower. That was enough to launch the GNX from 0 to 60 miles per hour in just 4.6 seconds, making it one of the fastest cars of its time. The all-black, no-nonsense exterior made it look like a villain's car, and that's exactly what it was. An underdog that embarrassed the big-name muscle and sports cars of the era. It had a beefed-up suspension, a reworked transmission, and a special torque arm rear suspension that gave it insane acceleration and handling. Unfortunately, Buick only made 547 GNXs. Most of them went straight into collections, stored away as future classics. Decades later, it remains one of the most feared and respected muscle cars ever made. 5. Mercury Capri ASC McLaren. The regular Mercury Capri was already a lesser-known cousin of the Ford Mustang. The ASC McLaren version took things to another level, turning it into an ultra-rare, high-performance machine that disappeared almost as fast as it arrived. So, what made the ASC McLaren special? First, ASC and McLaren, the same McLaren known for building race cars, teamed up to create a high-performance, limited edition version of the Capri. This wasn't just an aesthetic package. The car received serious upgrades, including a 5.0-liter high-output V8 with 200-plus horsepower, a custom-tuned suspension, and lightweight 15-inch mesh wheels. The biggest visual difference was the sleek, European-inspired styling. It had a lowered stance, a unique front air dam, and a clean, aggressive look that made it stand out from regular Capri and Mustangs. ASC even removed the rear seats in the convertible version, turning it into a two-seater roadster, something almost unheard of for American muscle cars at the time. As anyone expected, less than 500 were made between 1984 and 1986. That's an insanely low production number, especially compared to the thousands of Mustangs and Camaros built in the same era. Even among Mercury fans, the ASC McLaren was a niche car, and because it was built in such small numbers, it never had the chance to gain mainstream popularity. Most of these cars were simply lost to time. Because these cars were hand-built in small numbers, they are incredibly rare today. Czwarty Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS Aerocoupe. The Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS Aerocoupe was built for one reason: to dominate NASCAR. While the regular Monte Carlo SS was already a solid performance car, Chevrolet needed something sleeker and more aerodynamic to compete on the track. That's how the Aerocoupe was born, but because it was built in small numbers, it has become one of the rarest muscle cars of the 1980s. At first glance, the Aerocoupe looked a lot like a standard Monte Carlo SS, but there was one key difference: the sloped rear window. This wasn't just for style, it helped the car cut through the air at high speeds, giving Chevrolet an edge in stock car racing. Since NASCAR rules required at least 200 street versions to be built for it to be legal on the track, Chevy produced just 200 Aerocoupes in 1986. The car was such a success in racing that they made more in 1987. But only 6,052 were built, a tiny number compared to other muscle cars of the era. The car's built with a 5.0-liter high-output V8, making 180 horsepower and 225 pound-feet of torque. That might not seem like much today, but back in the 80s, it was enough to give the car some real muscle. Plus, it had a sport-tuned suspension and a limited-slip rear differential, making it handle better than most big American coupes of the time. Despite its NASCAR roots, the Aerocoupe never became a mainstream hit, and most people didn't even know it existed. Ultimately, the Monte Carlo SS Aerocoupe is a true 80s legend that disappeared before most people even knew what it was. Third, Dodge Mirada CMX. Since the advent of time, Dodge is known for building some of the most aggressive muscle cars in history. The Mirada CMX was a rare and forgotten gem from the early 1980s. It had style, luxury, and muscle car roots. The Mirada was Dodge's personal luxury coupe, competing with cars like the Chevy Monte Carlo and Ford Thunderbird, but the CMX version was the real performance model. It came with a 5.9-liter V8, making 185 horsepower, which was impressive during its time when emissions regulations were choking the power out of most cars. Some versions even had a 4-barrel carburetor, helping it put down solid torque and give it that classic muscle car feel. For those who wanted something a little different, Dodge also offered a 5.2-liter V8, though it wasn't as powerful. But what really made the Mirada CMX stand out was its sleek, European-inspired styling. It had a long hood, a low stance, and a unique waterfall grille, making it look more refined than Dodge's usual muscle cars. The vinyl landau roof, special CMX badging, and sporty aluminum wheels gave it an upscale touch, but it was still a true muscle car at heart. Some models even came with an optional sport handling package, improving its ride and performance. Despite its massive success, Dodge only built around 5,000 CMX models, between 1980 and 1983. That's an incredibly low number, especially considering how many Monte Carlos and Thunderbirds were sold at the time. The Mirada 910 never caught on with buyers, and most of them got scrapped and simply forgotten. Many ended up in junkyards, while others were used as parts cars for more popular Dodge models. For collectors, finding one in good condition is a challenge, but those who do own one have a unique and underrated piece of Dodge's performance legacy. Second, Pontiac Turbo Trans Am. The late 1970s and early 1980s were tough times for American muscle cars. New emissions regulations, rising gas prices, and stricter government standards were killing the high-horsepower V8s that had dominated the previous decade. The legendary big block engines were being phased out, and car manufacturers had to find new ways to create performance cars while meeting stricter rules. Pontiac engineers saw potential in turbocharging. Instead of trying to push out bigger displacement engines, they decided to extract more power from a smaller engine by using a turbocharger to force air into the combustion chamber. This would allow the 4.9-liter engine to perform at levels similar to the bigger, older V8s, all while meeting new fuel economy and emissions requirements. After the success of Trans Am, Pontiac took things in a different direction in the early 1980s by adding a turbocharger, something almost unheard of in American muscle cars at the time. The result was a rare and misunderstood performance machine that quickly disappeared. In 1980 and 1981, Pontiac replaced its big 6.6-liter V8 with a 4.9-liter turbocharged V8 to keep up with new emissions rules. This wasn't just a gimmick. This was the first turbocharged Trans Am ever built. It made 210 horsepower and 345 pound-feet of torque, which was actually more than the old 6.6-liter engine. It even had a functional turbo boost gauge on the hood, so drivers could watch the turbo in action. Unlike naturally aspirated V8s, which rely on air intake alone, the turbocharged 4.9-liter engine used exhaust gases to spin a turbine, which then compressed incoming air, forcing it into the engine at higher pressure. This extra air allowed for better combustion and more power output. To keep everything running smoothly, Pontiac also added a knock sensor to prevent detonation. The system would automatically adjust the timing if it detected any issues, making the Turbo Trans Am one of the first American performance cars with computer-controlled engine management. Pontiac didn't stop at the engine. The Turbo Trans Am got a beefed-up suspension, a special rear axle, and unique badging that set it apart from regular Trans Ams. On paper, the Turbo Trans Am was impressive. It could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in around 7.5 seconds. Not groundbreaking by today's standards, but very respectable for the early 1980s when most performance cars were struggling to break the 10-second mark. The turbocharged engine also produced a healthy 345 pound-feet of torque, which made the car feel much more powerful than its horsepower rating suggested. However, real-world performance was hit or miss. Some drivers loved the way the turbo kicked in, delivering a sudden rush of power. Others found it unpredictable, with turbo lag making the power delivery feel inconsistent. This was a time when turbo technology was still relatively new to American cars, and Pontiac was learning as they went. One thing Pontiac absolutely nailed was the styling. The Turbo Trans Am was one of the best-looking cars of its time. It featured the aggressive stance and flared fenders that made the Trans Am iconic, but with some unique touches that set it apart. Despite its innovations, the Turbo Trans Am didn't last. After just 2 years, Pontiac discontinued the turbocharged model. Only about 7,500 were built in total, and most people didn't know what to do with them. Turbo technology was still new in American cars, and many owners didn't maintain them properly. Of the 7,500 built, only a fraction remains in original condition. However, the prices for well-preserved examples have been rising, as many fans recognize its place in muscle car history. Today, almost every major car manufacturer offers turbocharged models, proving that Pontiac was ahead of its time. First, Chevrolet Camaro Z/28. The Chevrolet Camaro Z/28 was already an iconic muscle car by the 1980s. but there were certain versions that became incredibly rare. While the Z/28 name had been around since the late 60s, the third generation Z/28 took things in a new direction with sharp, aerodynamic styling and high-tech performance upgrades. But not all Z28s were created equal, and these features have become a big part of next-generation automobiles. One of the most elusive Z28 models was the 1985 and 1986 Z28, with the L69 high-output 5.0-liter V8 engine found in the best Chevrolet models with high horsepower. This engine produced 190 horsepower and 240 pound-feet of torque, which was impressive for the mid-80s when muscle cars were still recovering from strict emissions regulations. What made it special was its 4-barrel carburetor and aggressive camshaft, giving it quicker throttle response and making it one of the most fun-to-drive Camaros of its era. But it was only available for 2 years, making it rare, even when it was new. The Z/28 also had a legendary look, with its ground effects, hood scoops, and aggressive stance. The IROC-Z, which replaced the Z/28 name in later years, stole most of the attention, leaving these rare early Z/28 models forgotten by most people. Today, many of them were either raced or modified beyond recognition,